Our next guest is someone that I've known for many years. I knew him when he started his business, Budget Signs, in San Francisco, when he was a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, when he was a member of the California State Assembly, and then when he became a California State Senator. And when he finally left that position, he was one of the few people I've ever seen who earned praise and salutations from both sides of the aisle. I'm very delighted to have with me here in our virtual studio my friend for many years, former Senator Mark Leno. Mark?
Invitation for the opportunity. Was it W.C. Fields who suggested never share a stage with animals or children?
Yes, and he was right. So I'm sorry I didn't let you share the stage. It was a lead-in, but you know what? You can do it. You can upstage the dog.
Well, it is wonderful to be with you, and let me return the compliment. I've so appreciated not only sharing these many decades together in San Francisco with you and Alfredo, but also to see your career continue to grow by leaps and bounds and all the wonderful projects that you engage yourself in. And this great pause, it's been fun to watch it and to now participate with you in it.
Well, thank you, Mark. And of course, you know, there's been a lot written lately, especially about those of us in the gay community, the LGBTQ community, saying that this isn't our first pandemic. And of course, that's very true. AIDS impacted all of us, some more than others, and certainly no one more than you. And at the risk of being personal, I would just like to start this conversation with telling us about your experience of AIDS, HIV, and how that, in a very real way, unless I'm mistaken, led you into a political career.
Sure. One thing that this virus, without a doubt, has in common with HIV is that the epidemic gets very real when it knocks on your door. Until then, it's a friend or a friend of a friend or something you read about or hear about in the news. But when it's in your home, it's another thing entirely. And I think we've all benefited from the reporting of Chris Cuomo, for example, who has shared with us his experience with the virus and then making sure he did everything possible to make sure that his wife and family didn't get it, though she did. And so there is the personal side of the story and there's the reporting side of the story. So with regard to HIV, as a gay man who was in San Francisco from 1977, when we started to first hear of the first cases and the famous photographs that Bobby Campbell put up of his own KS Legion in the windows of what's now Walgreens at the corner of 18th and Castro around 1981. And we didn't know what it was. It was certainly frightful. And then we saw it sweep through our community so very, very quickly. And whereas with this virus, it was genome plotted within weeks and tests were developed to identify who's carrying, who's not. Of course, this federal government has completely botched the testing process so that we can benefit from that knowledge. But we didn't, as a globe, isolate HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, until 1984. So we were just in the dark. And so all of the treatment of those who were, and the deaths were very gruesome because, of course, it destroyed immune systems. And so all sorts of horrific diseases were visited upon those with the virus, no longer with an immune system, to fight off things that the rest of us fight off regularly. We didn't even have that test until 1984. It knocked on my door when the younger brother of my partner, Doug Jackson, who was just out of college, had lost 50 pounds over the summer of 1985 and was no longer able to care for himself, nor could his young roommates. And we decided that since we had an extra bedroom and bath here in San Francisco, and probably for what it was worth, the best medical care and understanding of the virus right here in San Francisco at UCSF, his 23-year-old brother Stuart came to live with us. That was Thanksgiving of '85. He was dead of pneumocystis pneumonia the first week in March, '86. So it happened very quickly. At that point, there was a test, and Doug and I knew we needed to get tested. And we discovered at that point in mid '85, excuse me, '86, that Doug was positive, that I was negative. And by June of 1990, Doug had died. So that is earth shattering for everybody and anybody. Uh, I became lifelong friends and close relations with his beautiful family from Decatur, just outside Atlanta, Georgia. A Christian family in the best sense of the word. And I, of course, from Jewish background, uh, never had that kind of an intimate relationship with a family that took its religion and religious beliefs so to heart. And though his parents had to deal with the unfamiliarity of having two out of, well, actually three out of three gay sons, two of whom got sick and died. Doug's twin brother, Win, is alive and well in New York. But they had to deal with all of that along with the stigma, which was enormous. And I should really cut to the chase. Though this virus is carrying a stigma as well, and our president only uses it to further separate and divide the country for his own political purposes, we know that Asian Americans are attempted to be blamed with this, and there have been violence against the Asian community, Asian American community. We also know that for multiple and complex social and medical reasons, there are disproportionate cases of positive testing and deaths in the African American Latino communities as we speak. So, I saw one horrible quote today by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, who blamed the victims of these meatpacking plants for their own demise. That it's not the working conditions in these factories, it's the way they live their lives that is imposing this virus upon them. So there's a similarity as well. Stigmatizing minority communities. It's always about pointing the finger. The president himself has said, I take absolutely no responsibility for this. So he's got to blame others. Blames China, blames the workers as he forces them back into unsafe working conditions. A lot of similarities. I just went back to look at an old YouTube. Anyone can find it. Larry Speaks was a young man who was the press secretary for President Ronald Reagan in the mid 1980s, early 80s as well. One of the first questions ever at a press conference, at a press briefing in the White House, the question addressed to Larry Speaks, was about this new gay plague, as it was called at the time, because we hadn't even given it a name, we didn't know the virus. And he not only couldn't answer the question responsibly as to what is the president's position on this, has he been briefed? Is he aware that there are already hundreds of deaths and then within months, thousands of deaths? And it was a laughing joke at that press briefing. The press corps laughed at it. The reporter was derided for having an interest in it. Larry Speaks' comment and response was, well, I don't have it. Do you? Smirk, smirk, giggle, giggle. That's how it was dealt with at first. And of course, it's a historical fact that the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, would not even say the three letters HIV or make reference to the thousands of Americans who had already died until 1985, when the death toll was over 20,000. It's pretty stunning. And at that point, Reagan said, oh, yes, this is a top priority for me. We're going to invest many millions in research on this. And then when he unveiled his 1986 federal budget, he actually cut funding for research by 11%. So it was cruel, it was disrespectful, it was heartless in every way. Again, very similar to the way this president is dealing with the pandemic.
Yeah, you know, that the first time that Ronald Reagan said the word AIDS, I remember it because I was actually there. I was much younger, obviously. And I was actually a catering waiter at a firm called Glorious Food. And there was a big event. It was actually right before the first AIDS conference. And I remember the president said it, but he was somehow very offhand about it. And Elizabeth Taylor was there at that event. And I remember an interview she did years later. She said that was the first and only time that I did not interrupt a president of the United States when he got something wrong. And that's when she became such a heroine to not only the AIDS HIV community, but I think to the LGBT community in specific. You know, my last question for you, Mark, is with that history that you have just shared with us in a very personal way and your decades of leadership politically, always sticking up for the disenfranchised, whether it was people living with AIDS, HIV, communities of color dealing with discrimination, the transgender community, even when there were members of the LGBT community, or I should say the LGB community, who didn't understand issues of the transgender community. You always stood up for the underdog. Right now, with all of that history and having seen another administration ignore a pandemic and go against science, what advice would you have, speaking as someone who's been through this, a gay elder, as it were, pardon me? What advice do you have for this generation of young people facing this pandemic, for all people facing this pandemic?
A couple of things, David. Very thoughtful question. First and foremost, even in the darkest hours and our staying in place has challenged all of us in very real ways, each of us with different circumstances, some in very cramped studio apartments, others sharing small spaces, others having to go through it all by themselves, different experiences, but a challenge to all of us. And especially to younger people and young adults for whom I have such concern right now because their future lives are at risk because we don't know what our economy, what our nation, if we'll have a nation. And I don't want to get dark about it because what I'm about to say is never relinquish hope. And for obvious reasons, we've got to keep our spirits up. We've got to keep our mental health in good form and never be shy to ask for help, for counseling, if that's where you find yourself. But don't give up hope because we're all going to do everything we can by staying in place and by supporting our community organizations that need funding right now because everything's at risk. So we want to give hope, and isn't that a coincidence that that was Harvey Miller's big message, of course, always his use of the word in a slightly different context. But beyond that, as a community of us's, and that's also borrowing from Harvey's lexicon, and the us's are all of us who are a part of minority communities, whether it's because we're Jewish or gay or from an ethnic community or treated like a minority due to our gender, uh, even though there are more women among us than men. We know where discrimination is. We us's have to continue to build coalitions and keep our coalitions strong because it's only united and together that we can overcome the hurdles, the obstacles, the hate, the lies, and all that those who are currently in power in Washington are doing just to hold on to power for the sake of power itself, not to save a life, not to save a job, not to save our economy, just to win an election in November. So it can be very dispiriting. Uh, Nancy Pelosi's phrase, if I can summon it right now, is we don't criticize or we organize. And we've got to think wisely in political terms. How can we make sure that we keep ourselves intact, our communities intact, and then do the work that's necessary to change the course of this nation come November, because the future depends upon it.
Thank you, Mark. You know, it's always a pleasure speaking with you from one us to another us. Thank you. And
We're all in.
since I know that you would have been a wonderful rabbi, that rabbinical training came in handy. Thank you for that, Mark. That
And if I
was,
may, just one
of course,
last, since you touch on that. And when I talk about hope, I think we have to take a step prior to that, which is to realize, as tough as times may be, even for those who are getting sick and hopefully come out of it in one piece, to count our blessings every day, to have gratitude. Gratitude, I think, probably is the foundation stone for hope. Because as long as we are appreciative, and sometimes on the toughest days it gets to the most basic, grateful for having a roof over our heads, grateful for having food on the table, grateful to have something in our pocket to go get tomorrow's food for the table, uh, a friend that we can call when in need, a family member, uh, things that so many people do not have right now and are fearful because they don't know where that next paycheck's coming from and they don't know where the next rent check's coming from. So for all of us who have these basic needs covered, uh, be grateful, count our blessings in a regular fashion, daily, by the hour. We're in crisis mode right now. And then with that in place, hang on to that hope, which can be the fuel to fire our activism and engagement.
well, thank you, Mark. You know, my grandma, as I often quote, says there were two phrases that were important to remember: please and thank you. So please be safe. Please come back and talk with us soon after this is over, so you can share your thoughts with us. And thank you. Thank you for that.
And I thank you
Jen?
too, Dave. Keep up your good work. And Jen, thank
Thank
you.
you.